It's our pleasure to have with us at Google today Daniel Dennett. Has a long and distinguished career. I won't try to summarize all of it. You can Google it. Instead, I'll just try to introduce very briefly the book that he's written most recently and is talking about today, which is a collection or a toolkit for thinking. And I think the reason I think it's such a great book is because a lot of it is our toolkit. It's these computational tools for thinking that we sort of take for granted, but Dan is trying to introduce to the rest of the world who sometimes aren't aware of how to think like that. And so what do I mean by that? Well, in his 1995 book on evolution, he wrote that life on Earth has been generated over billions of years by an algorithmic process. And that's kind of a natural way for us to think about it, but it's a hard way for other people to think about it. And some people don't quite understand that by taking lots and lots of small steps that you could arrange and come up with this result. And other philosophers who we won't name have taken the approach, well, look at these incredible results, and if I simulate the steps for 3 or 4 steps, I don't get there, so it must be magic. Rather than saying, well, maybe a billion or 100 billion is actually qualitatively different than a couple steps. So Dan reminds us how to think that way. He also reminds us that there can be emergent properties that aren't implicit in any one piece of an ensemble, and yet they come out in the end. We're all familiar with that. You know, our programs have emergent properties that we didn't expect, and we bang our heads trying to fix them. So we're aware of it, but the rest of the world isn't. And so that's why they need a book like this. I just want to talk about one more of the tools, and this is the using lay audience as a decoy. So this is a trick if you have a philosophy professor who's not explaining all the details. Rather than ask them to explain it to you, you say, oh, well, why don't you give a lecture to this introductory class, and then it will become more clear, because the professor will have to work harder to get it to that level rather than try to keep it at the professor-to-professor level. Well, one of our Google employees, Rob Pike, wrote a book where he talked about a similar approach. Instead of calling it the lay audience as decoy approach, he called it the teddy bear approach, which is there was a introductory class in computer programming for which the TAs were overstocked, and there was always a long waiting line of students waiting to get in to talk to the TAs about why the program didn't work. And what they instituted was a chair that held a teddy bear outside their office. Before you were allowed to talk to the TAs, you had to talk to the teddy bear. And so the students would come up and say, oh, teddy bear, my program doesn't work, and you know, and it must work because this loop, see, this could never be more than one, oh, except if, oh, never mind. And it turns out the teddy bear successfully solved about half the problems, and people didn't have to go on to the TA. So I think that's sort of in the same toolbox. And Dan will tell you about the rest of the tools.
Thanks, Peter. That's a great introduction. I'm going to add the teddy bear. It occurred to me as you were telling us about that probably explains the success rate of psychoanalysts right there. You can replace them with a teddy bear and get the same results. Yeah, teddy bears are a lot cheaper. So I want to talk about better tools for thinking. One of my best students, a Swede named Bo Dahlbom, once said, you can't do much carpentry with your bare hands, and you can't do much thinking with your bare brain. He hits the nail on the head right there. It's obvious in a way when you think that even something as simple as a word is a tool. It's a thinking tool. And these thinking tools have been around for a long time, and recently we've learned that maybe these thinking tools are having a remarkable effect. How many of you know what the Flynn effect is? A few of you do. And the rest of you, all right, now let me tell you about the Flynn effect. Jim Flynn, it's named after him, but he's not really the one that did the first research, but he's the one who drew people's attention to it. It turns out that IQ worldwide is up. And it's up a significant amount. If you use today's test, if you gave that test to a person who got 100 back in the 30s, they'd get probably an 80. And we'd be viewed as sort of almost retarded. I mean, there's a big jump. It's like 20 or 30 IQ points. Of course, IQ tests are always scaled with 100 as average. But if you use the same test items, at the very least, we've gotten a lot better at taking IQ tests. And it has nothing directly to do with how much tutoring or schooling or your genes. It's a very large effect, and it can't be due to improvements in our genes. We're talking about such short time periods. Jim Flynn thinks, and I hope he's right, and that doesn't mean he's right, but I think there's a lot to be said for it, that what's happened is that the thinking tools that are first developed and tested and debugged by scientists and engineers and other sort of professional thinkers have been filtering down into everyday people's thinking. Even as simple an idea as percentage, which kids, you just pick it up very fast. And 50 years ago, 100 years ago, that was a pretty complicated concept for a lot of people. They just weren't ready for that. And so probably it's all these thinking tools that we install without even realizing we're doing it. We install in our own brains and in other brains. That is a main source of our improved thinking. And certainly that is the thesis that I want to explore in any case, because what I'm doing in this book, as a philosopher, I discovered that a lot of my colleagues are remarkably unself-conscious about the tools of the trade. Weird, because philosophers are famously self-conscious and reflective and navel-gazing, but a lot of them don't ever ask, wait a minute, how do I do that? And why do I think that's a good way of proceeding? What tools am I using? And I wanted them to become more self-conscious. I want everybody to become more self-conscious about the tools that they use. So what kind of thinking tools are there? There's words, as I say, and numbers, of course, and diagrams and maps and methods, and intuition pumps, which is a term I coined more than 30 years ago to describe, well, in the first instance, it was John Searle's notorious Chinese room. And since I was beating up on that intuition pump, a lot of people thought that intuition pumps were bad. No, I think they're wonderful. It's just you got to have good ones. There's defective pumps, and there's good ones, and the way you tell the difference is, as you know, by reverse engineering. Doug Hofstadter came up with the lovely phrase, you want to turn all the knobs on an intuition pump to see what makes it do its work. You want to try out the variation. Nothing mysterious about why that works. It's just Mill's method of differences. You're just empirically testing to see what variations make what differences, see how robust the intuition pump is under deformation, and sometimes they're remarkably sensitive to tiny variations in the way you tell the story. Then you know it's probably a defective pump, not doing what you think it's doing. So what intuition pumps are persuaders. And it's important that they're persuaders. So much thinking, good thinking, is accomplished in a friendly but competitive environment where I am trying to persuade an interlocutor, a target, that P, and the target is trying to persuade me that not P, and this opponent process is actually a good way very often of getting at the truth. So they're also discoverers, they're attention holders, and they're anchors for fixed points. In my work in philosophy, there are no fixed points. That's the point of philosophy. Philosophy is what you're doing when you're not quite sure what the right questions to ask are. And everything is up for reconsideration, always. But how do you proceed then? You say, well, maybe this is a fixed point for this discussion, and you sort of put a pin down here, and here's one here, and here's one here, and then you see, well, suppose we take those on board. What can we do with this idea with a few of these candidate fixed points? One thing you may do with them is throw all three of them out, or throw out one against the other two. It's in this ineluctably informal. There's no algorithm for doing this, certainly not yet. This is an informal, exploratory process for which there are really no rules, but intuition pumps are persuaders to use in those sort of harrowing circumstances. Here's one that isn't in the book, but I've talked about it a lot recently, and I think it's important to understand the context. The Macready explosion. This is Paul Macready. How many of you know Paul Macready? Oh, that's, well, good. I can educate you about that. You will know him, not by name, as the inventor of the Gossamer albatross. Visionary engineer, the greenest of green engineers, wonderful guy, died a few years ago. And in a TED Talk a few years back, he came up with the following startling observation. Let's go back 10,000 years to the dawn of agriculture. At that point, human beings around the world were beginning to domesticate animals and plants, of course. And at that point, our species, Homo sapiens, and these are, of course, entirely modern Homo sapiens, at that point, 10,000 years ago, if you put them on one side of a balance scale, together with their pets and livestock, all the domesticated vertebrates on one side, including us, and you put all the rest of the terrestrial vertebrates on the other side, animals, not the insects, not the worms, not the fish. He calculated that at that time, 10,000 years ago, we and our livestock accounted for a fraction of 1% by weight of the terrestrial vertebrate biomass. What do you think the percentage is today? Any guesses? 10%. Over 50. 99? Are you kidding? No, it's 98. It is 98. We human beings have engulfed the planet. This is one of the most astonishing biological phenomena that has ever happened. And here's what Paul said about this. Over billions of years on a unique sphere, chance has painted a thin covering of life, complex, improbable, wonderful, and fragile. Suddenly, we humans have grown in population, technology, and intelligence to a position of terrible power. We now wield the paintbrush. I've highlighted the technology and intelligence because those are the thinking tools. The only difference between us and our ancestors of 100,000 years ago is the thinking tools. We got the same genes, we got pretty much the same digestive systems, the same muscles, the thinking tools, the same brains. The thinking tools have changed us and made all of this power possible. It is the source of our power, which raises a sort of chicken-egg problem. Did evolved tools make us smarter, or did we evolve to become smart enough to make tools? And like all good chicken and egg questions, the answer is yes. It's a co-evolutionary bootstrapping process where you have a little evolution, makes us smarter, and then we can be smarter about making tools. We can become self-conscious about the tools we make. Our ancestors weren't self-conscious. They didn't invent words. They didn't coin words. They just found themselves using words, and it made them smarter. Now we are very deliberate. We have become intelligent designers of tools. But initially, we weren't intelligent designers of tools. We were simply the beneficiaries of tools. Well, how did they get there then? Not by the genes. They evolved culturally. My next book is going to be on cultural evolution and that story, but I'm not going to say more about it now because I'm going to be looking today at recent tools, intelligently designed, supposedly intelligently designed thinking tools. Everybody knows reductio ad absurdum, where this is the sort of crowbar of logical argument. It's what you use, you take your opponent, your target's premise, you take your target's thesis on board for the sake of argument, and then you use the crowbar, you try to deduce a contradiction from that. And if you succeed, you win. And we use it all the time, very unselfconsciously. Very few people, probably you've used a sort of disguised reductio 3 or 4 times in the last day without, you know. You said something like, well, if that's a bear, then bears have antlers. That's a reductio. You'll find yourself making them. Now, why do I bother mentioning that, since it's a very familiar tool? Because I want to point out that rhetorical questions, the questions you're not supposed to answer, many of them, not all of them, but very many of them are in fact disguised reductio ad absurdum arguments. They imply a reductio ad absurdum argument that the writer doesn't bother presenting. It's too obvious. It would be embarrassing. So you just get the rhetorical question, and nudge, nudge, you go on. So what I want to do is to create in you a little alarm, sort of like a Google alert, so that whenever you see a rhetorical question in an argument, ding, you think, rhetorical question. You look to see, maybe I can just answer it. Maybe there is a perfectly unembarrassing answer. I remember years ago seeing a Peanuts cartoon, and then the next to the last frame, Charlie Brown is saying, who's to say what the difference is between right and wrong? Lucy in the last panel says, I will. And think about answering a rhetorical question by just answering it. See if you can do that. A similar thing is what I call the surely alarm. Whenever you see the word surely, a bell should ring. Ding. Let me just give you one. All right. Oh yes, you could make a computer that could sort fruit by its color, but surely no computer. Come on. Ding. Surely no computer could ever have a favorite color or appreciate color. When you hear that, surely, you are being, now maybe you think, yeah, I go along with that one, that's got to be right. Actually, in this audience, I bet a lot of people say, I don't think that's so obvious. Why surely? Well, the author wants to get this proposition, the proposition that follows it, into the discussion, thinks it's true, thinks it's obvious, but it's not quite obvious enough so that it goes without saying. If it did, he wouldn't have to say it. It would go without saying. It goes with saying, but he doesn't want to bother arguing for it, so he gives you just a little nudge and says, surely. So be on the lookout. I tested my hunch about this by going through, thanks to Google, thanks to string search, going through some dozens of philosophy of mind papers that were online, counting up the surelys. Most papers don't have the word surely in them, but I found several dozen instances of surely, and about a third of them were, I thought, clearly cases of these. This was the weakest place in the whole argument. This is the place you want to look first. So now if I've alerted you on rhetorical questions and on surely, another one is rathering, rather, as in, it's not the case that blah, blah, blah. Rather, it's ta-da-da-da-da. Rathering signals a dichotomy, and very often it signals a false dichotomy. And what you should do is, again, have a little alarm ring for rathering. When you see the word rather, take a good hard look and see if you can't say, well, maybe both blah, 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 and da-da-da. That hasn't been asserted. It's just been presupposed and glossed over with the word rather. So if I get you to adopt these habits, look what I've done. I've installed an app on your necktop. And I mean that literally. The thing between your ears is a kind of computer. And I don't have to tell you folks that the power of a computer is the apps and the levels, and you can build and build and build and build and build apps on top of apps. That's what the thinking tools do. And that's what makes us smarter. You know, a CPU without an operating system, you can't do very much with it. You start building up all the software, and that's where the power comes from. Okay. I don't have to tell you that computers are thinking tools par excellence. And in the book, I put an interlude on computers in the book. And Peter, I'm happy to say, he mentioned that. I want everybody who reads the book to come away with a little bit more basic understanding of just where computers get their power. One of the things I do, and this is so eccentric, I think that's probably the only trade book in history to have this feature. In this chapter called The 7 Secrets of Computer Power Revealed, I teach everybody how to program a register machine. A how-long simple register machine that can just do increment and decrement and branch. And they teach it how to do arithmetic, and then they teach it how to do some other things. And there's problem sets. I've actually got some simple problem sets in this book. And I say, well, you don't have to do them, of course, but if you really want to understand, if you want to be a computer for a while and understand what it is. And of course, they learn about loops, they learn about counters, they learn about all kinds of things that they hear these words in other contexts and they think they know what they mean. Now they're going to know what they mean. The reason I think that's so important, and again, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, is one of the most important epistemological facts about computers is that if you can make a computer simulation of something that works, you know to a moral certainty there's no magic, there's no morphic resonance, there's no psionic forces or ectoplasm. It's good, old-fashioned, everyday, hard, honest causation. And you just got to prove of it because the computer itself that's what it is. There's no place for any mystery forces to play a role. But people shouldn't just take that on faith. They should know in their bones why that's true and how it's true. And that's what that section is supposed to show them. Some intuition pumps don't even have words, they're just images. I love this one. This is from my friend Matt Ridley, wonderful evolutionary biologist and journalist. And it just, startles for a moment, but what points can you make with it? I'll just make one, then move on. On the left, you see an Acheulean hand axe. On the right, I don't have to tell you what that is. The Acheulean hand axe was made by our ancestors without any discernible stylistic change, without any discernible design improvement for over 1 million years. Absolute stasis. Amazing. Some people have even thought maybe it wasn't to be used as an axe at all. Maybe it was like the peacock's tail. Maybe it was, hey, you want to see my hand axe collection? I am so good that I can make hand axes all day long and still get enough to eat, take care of myself. Bragging. Sort of like having a Lamborghini or something like that. But notice that the one on the right, familiar as it is to us, it probably has a rather short lifetime ahead of it. We may have, how many bet that there will still be mice in 100 years? Right, point made. Now here's a similar comparison. On the left, we have a termite castle, Australian termite castle. And on the right, we have La Sagrada Familia, the great Gaudi church in Barcelona. As I think you can see, they're stunningly similar structures. And even internally, if you look at the cutaways of them, there's a lot of design features that they have in common. These are two remarkable artifacts made by animals. And yet, for all their similarities, you can see at a glance that they are the products of profoundly different histories of design and construction. The one on the left this is bottom-up Darwinian design and construction. The termites, the individual termites, could hardly be more clueless. They don't know what they're doing. There's no boss termite, there's no architect, there's no blueprint, there's no leadership roles, there's no hierarchy. This is bottom-up activity, and it produces that. Whereas Gaudí is almost comical. He was like a cartoon caricature of the inspired genius, autocratic, dictatorial, laying down the law. He had blueprints and manifestos. He had accounts of everything, and he bossed people around, and he told the bosses how to boss the people. It was a classic case of hierarchical design and construction. Here is one way of looking at the problem, I think, that evolution and cultural evolution has to explain. How did our planet get from the left to the right? How did we get from termite type R&D to Gaudí type R&D? I think the answer has to be, well, Gaudí did not have a bare brain. He had all those thinking tools, and the thinking tools are the key to opening up top-down, as it were, intelligent design type design. What Darwin showed us is that we don't need the intelligent designer, that lots of bottom-up, mindless grubbing around, trial and error, will eventually produce all the wonders of the biosphere. But then the process keeps right on going with cultural evolution, and pretty soon it starts to reverse itself, and we get more and more intelligent design, to where we now have people like Turing, better example than Gaudí because he really had the goods, who, notice, when he built his computer, he already had proof of concept, he had the blueprint, he had the design, he'd proved it all. Nobody would have ever given him the money to make that computer if he hadn't proved it in advance. This is where the idea really is leading the way. That's intelligent design. And we've got to explain how it has happened to be one of the fruits of evolution, because it wasn't the cause. You know? The Bible says, in the beginning was the Word. No. The Word, very recent development. The Word is the beginning of intelligent design, though. The Bible is sort of right about that. You know? Another thinking tool, which is just a picture, but what a lovely picture. And by the way, this is Leonard Eisenberg's version of the Tree of Life, and you can get it on T-shirts, big shiny posters that you put up in your office. There's all sorts of ways you can get it if you go to his website. And what I love about it, there's many different ways of representing the Tree of Life. This has a few nice features. I just want to sort of point them out to you. Oh, run out of battery somewhat. Okay, there's no other pointer up here, is there? I'll just do it like this. So, here's a pointer. A thinking tool. Right here on the end of my finger. How wonderful. Yeah. So, time goes out radially. Here's the birth of the earth. Here's the birth of life, the origin of life. And as you can see, the bacteria and the archaea are the single-celled organisms. And then we have a period of single-celled eukaryotes. This is a great, great, great moment in the history of life. It's the eukaryotic revolution, when the endosymbiotic event put two of these types together. They joined forces and became a more powerful thing. This is technology transfer. This is what happens when you have two independent lineages. They've been evolving independently for 1 billion years, and now they join forces. They don't all have to reinvent the wheel. They get the benefit of each kind. And those eukaryotic cells, all the rest of life is eukaryotes. You've heard of the Cambrian explosion? There it is. In a very short period of time, tremendous flourishing of different kinds of life, a period of fantastic, fecund R&D. How is it explained? That's a story I'd love to tell, but for another day. You can see mass extinctions. And then way over here, this last little fork here, that's about 7 million years on that scale, which is about the length of time since we shared an ancestor with our nearest relative, the chimpanzee. And of course, of that 7 million years, only 1 million years at most has any language. Now, some people will push it back a little further. The Acheulean hand axe comes before language. Some people think that's a controversial issue. But so now notice, Cambrian explosion, fabulous. The McCready explosion happens there and transforms the planet. All thanks to thinking tools. So now, a few recent intuition pumps that are in the book, because I haven't really talked about them. These are these little stories. So here's an intuition pump I recently devised to discomfort neuroscientists and cognitive scientists who've been going around saying, I think, ill-considered things about what neuroscience teaches us about free will. So first, a little science fact. Damian Dennett, a very brilliant researcher in Amsterdam, has made a little microchip which controls obsessive-compulsive disorder. You implant it in a person's brain, really does it. Very good job. Science fiction. So one day, this guy with OCD goes to see his neurosurgeon, and she implants one of these Dennett microchips in his brain, sews him up, and the anesthesia wears off. And as he's about to leave, she debriefs him a little bit. She says, oh, and by the way, my staff will be monitoring you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week from our control room here. And you're going to think you have free will. You're going to think you're making your own decisions. But in fact, we're going to be making all the decisions for you. Free will is just an illusion for you. Have a nice life. Goodbye. And he believes her. Well, you know, shiny lab coat, all the rest. And as you might imagine, he becomes a little negligent in his habits and a little bit aggressive and indulges in some of his worst behaviors. And soon enough, he gets in trouble with the law. Gets hauled into court, charged with a fairly serious crime. He says, but Your Honor, I don't have free will. How do you know that? Well, my neurosurgeon told me, you know, free will is just an illusion. It feels like I'm making these decisions, but I'm not really. So they call the neurosurgeon to the stand and ask her to testify, and under oath, she says, yeah, that's what I told him. But, you know, it was just a joke. I was just messing with his head. Now, how many of you agree that she did not just a mean thing, a socially irresponsible thing, but she did a very serious harm to this guy? She, with her language, she did non-surgically what she claimed to do surgically. She disabled him as a moral agent by just convincing him that he didn't have free will. Now, I ask my neuroscientist friends, aren't you just doing the same thing wholesale? When you write these articles saying, we have learned in neuroscience that we don't have free will. The reason they say that turns out to be very bad reasons, having to do with, well, everything in your brain is determined by what happens in your brain a little bit before. Yeah, of course, so what? That doesn't show you don't have free will. They have a very simplistic idea of what free will is, but it's the idea that would actually ground moral responsibility. If you didn't have it, you wouldn't have moral responsibility. But they're not showing that at all, and I think that's irresponsible. Now you might say, well, if your brain is determined, then you don't have free will. How many of you are inclined to think if every event in your brain is determined, then you don't have free will? A lot of people, the general run of people think that's sort of even obviously true. So here's a little intuition pump to dissuade you from that. 2 lotteries. In lottery A, for after, the winning ticket is chosen after the tickets are sold. Most lotteries are like that, right? In lottery B, the winning ticket is chosen before the tickets are sold, and the stub is secretly put in a safe for safekeeping until the tickets are sold. Now, how many of you think that you're a fool to buy a ticket in lottery B that only lottery A gives you any chance of winning? How many think that they're even? Yeah. And so does most of the rest of the world. When you put it in these terms, they recognize that, no, you got a chance either way. And publishers here clearinghouse actually says, you may already have won. People see that they still have a chance if the winning tickets are chosen in advance. But now think, if determinism is true, then all your lottery tickets were chosen before you were born. At the Big Bang, if you like. And sort of put in a little secret safe in your body, and as life goes on, whenever you need whenever you need a coin flip, whenever you need a little chaos, you just take the next one out of the envelope, and you win some, you lose some. That's just as free as if there's a quantum miracle that happens right then and there. So what if they're chosen first? Well, somebody might say, well, you see, if all your lottery tickets are chosen before you're born, you're determined to have good luck on some occasions and bad luck on others. You're determined. Yeah, well, that's true even if indeterminism is true. Even if indeterminism is true, you're determined on some occasions to win and on some occasions to lose. You just don't know which. Fairness isn't always winning. You got to accept the fact that there's luck. And that luck is consistent with free will. But a lot of philosophers haven't seen it. A very good one, David Wiggins, once wrote some years ago about what he called the cosmic unfairness of determinism. And you can see, or many people think, yeah, right, it's a bummer if determinism is true. But I want to ask, what about the cosmic unfairness of indeterminism? Just as bad, you know. Life isn't always a picnic. That doesn't mean that we can't be responsible agents. Being a responsible agent, having free will in the sense that matters, has zip to do with whether physics is deterministic or indeterministic, or whether your brain is deterministic or indeterministic. It has to do with the software you got in your brain. It has to do with the competence that you have had installed in your brain since you were a little kid. If you are trained with a good moral upbringing, then you make the right decisions at the right time most of the time. And you are in general competent enough so when you screw up, you are held responsible. Why? Because you're good enough to be responsible. That's a long story. I'm not going to say more about that. We got time to quit this talk. So the book is sort of a tapas book. There are 77 chapters. And some of them are just a page. Some of them are maybe as much as 10 pages long. And they each introduce a tool, making it sort of autonomous, tried to make them all portable and accessible. So my recommendation is to try them out, take them for a spin, and above all, turn all the knobs to see how they work. Thanks for coming. Questions?
Hello. So intelligent design is better in some domains than others. We can design a very nice mobile phone or computer. When it comes to an economy, well, some may argue, but so far we've yet to show we can intelligently design an economy. Do you have, well, two questions. First of all, what do you think are the properties of things which are not very tractable to intelligent design? And do you think eventually all problems will fall into, we'll have the right tools in order to design everything?
No, I think there's a trade-off, which other people have described pretty well. Natural selection is a great engine, and it feeds on chaos and so-called randomness. But it works, remember, by trial and error, and there's an awful lot of errors, and it's a very wasteful product, very wasteful way of doing business. You've got to have a lot of failures. And so that's what happens, let's say, with an economy. And to that extent, that grubby old social Darwinist line about how, you know, the survival of the fittest in the economy has some truth to it, but that doesn't mean that we should simply honor that and make that a moral principle. because I think we have very good reasons to think that an unfettered, completely chaotic, laissez-faire, dog-eat-dog economy is not a good way to go. Too much harm can accrue, too much, you can get these winner-take-all situations, which can be very bad. And you know about winner-take-all algorithms, you know about opponent processes in the brain. In the work that I've been doing on how brains are organized, I think, first of all, they are computers, but they're very, very different from laptops, precisely because you've got 100 million or 200 million neurons. Each one is like a little termite. They actually have their own agendas. There's no two alike. And the way software works in the brain is by creating coalitions and getting them to work together. And unity is an achievement. It's possible, but it isn't built in from the ground. It isn't built in from the top down. And once we think about the brain being organized that way, we should think that probably economies are best built in that way too, without too much top-down central control, but with some policing to protect us from the excesses that otherwise would accrue.
Could you give your opinion on Newcomb's paradox?
Yeah, do you know what Newcomb's paradox is? This is the one boxer, two boxers. Okay, so you've got, first I'm going to have to explain it, see if I can get it right. So you're on a sort of quiz show, and you're given the following weird choice. You can be a one boxer, or you can be a two boxer. In one boxer there's $1,000, in the other there's $1 million versus 0. Now, but you don't, it would be hard enough if you had to choose either box A or box B. Would you take a chance on the million, or would you go for the sure 1,000? But that's not your choice. Your choice is either to go for box B, which is either got the million or nothing, or to go for both boxes. Got it? Well, one line of research, one line of thinking says, well, dummy, of course you go for both boxes. That way at least you get $1,000, and maybe you get $1,000,000, 1,000. That dominates. Decision tree, draw it out. That's the one you should do. And so it would be, except for one thing. The MC of the program tells you, oh, by the way, you're the 5,000th contestant on this show, and we're very good at predicting whether you're going to be a one boxer or a two boxer. And if we predict that you're going to make the two boxer choice, then there's only the $1,000 in box A, and we never put the $1 million in. We only put the $1 million in when we predict that you're going to go for one box. Oh, and you'll want to know our track record, it's almost perfect. They might add, well, you know, one poor devil went for box A and it was empty, or box B and it was empty. And one lucky devil out of 500, whatever, went for both and got both rewards. But in general, it's a very strong statistical correlation. So now, I ask you, how many of you go for both boxes? And how many of you go for just the one box? Yeah. What's nice about Newcomb's paradox is that it ain't obvious at all. And an awful lot of ink has been spilled trying to get clear about this. And I have myself not spilled any ink because I still don't have a firm view on it. I tend to think there must be something a little bit screwy about the setting up of this thought experiment, but it's very hard to show that. And I highly recommend it to you. There's a lot of good things that have been written about it. So I'm sorry I can't answer the question. I go back and forth. Some days I'm a one boxer, some days I'm a two boxer.
I wanted to ask you about determinism versus free will.
Yeah.
since you were talking about it earlier, and in particular, I think Hofstadter would talk about a levels disparity there, that determinism is kind of a totally different question than free will. I wondered if you could talk about that.
Yeah, Doug and I have talked about this over the years, and Doug disagrees with me. One of the few points where he and I have a serious disagreement. And he's actually quite pessimistic about this and thinks that the sense of free will that really matters is one that we can't have because of determinism. And I've done my level best in several books and many hours to convince him otherwise, and not without success yet. Unlike the fellow in my tale, it doesn't lead him to behave in a irresponsible way. So there's at least that to be said for it. I think that Doug, here's what I think the problem is, that the term free will, where does it come from? It comes from everyday, it comes from the law and from tradition. It's not a scientific term. It's a term you get from what's called the manifest image in philosophy, the world of colors and dollars and baseball and so forth, not the world of neurons and proteins and atoms, or for that matter, scientific laws. And when you look at its home in its home territory, free will, you can see it does two jobs. And they both seem to be definitive or constitutive. On the one hand, it seems definitive that, well, free will means uncaused, means it's free, there's no sufficient causal antecedent. That, for many people, they think that's just obvious. That's what free will means. But the other thing it means is it's the standard condition for being morally competent. For instance, how many of you believe yourself qualified, eligible to buy a car, to take out a loan? Yeah. And you sign the paper of your own free will. Now, there are people who don't have that competence. They're senile or they're too young. There's something you've got that they don't have, and it is the very condition of your living a free life as a citizen and conducting business, making promises that count, and so forth. I think that's the best notion of free will. That's the one that matters. And I think that notion has nothing to do with determinism. I don't think, for instance, I don't think your competence to sign a contract would be disparaged in the slightest if determinism were true. So I have argued for years that there's just no reason to prefer that your brain be deterministic over indeterministic. No reason at all, no good reason. I've recently had to back off that a little bit by a very persistent lover of indeterminism and free will, who finally showed me that there was, by my own lights, a condition where I would agree with them. I would wish for indeterminism in that case, and I'll tell you what it is. You all know the game rock, paper, and scissors? Well, the best way to play that game, of course, is to play random. It's very hard to fake randomness or to put together a random series. If you're random, you give your opponent no pattern to track at all. So they can't do any better than play random against you. You'll break even. But what if? So since that's the case, you might just as well memorize a few hundred entries in a table of random numbers and use that to guide your choices. You'll do fine as long as you don't let the other guy see your list, which would be terrible. So now I can tell you, here's the condition under which I would hope that the indeterminism was true. If I were playing rock, paper, and scissors for high stakes with God. I don't really anticipate that happening in the future. So I am quite content to live out my life in a deterministic world, and I'll take responsibility for my acts, even though they are, for all I know or care, determined by the gazillion things that happened both before and after my birth. Yes?
Is consciousness an epiphenomena of advanced biological systems and tends to disappear as you look back across the tree of life, or is it a fundamental dimension to nature and reality like the dimensions of space and time?
Okay, you said or. This is sort of a rathering. You didn't say rather, but there was a sort of rathering there. But I'll take it on, because I do not think that it is a fundamental category that splits the universe in two. I think that the idea that it is deeply rooted in culture, and in the end, I suppose it might be right. But I think that consciousness is like reproduction and metabolism and self-repair, healing, blood clotting. It's a very interestingly complex and deeply recursive biological phenomenon. It is not in the interesting sense, and there's many senses of consciousness, in the sense that we in this room are conscious, which is this sort of anchoring, that's home base from our own experience and our reading of literature. You know, we read novels and things like that. We have this sense of what a conscious life is like. I think we're the only creatures that have that kind of conscious life. I don't think dogs have it. I don't think dolphins have it. They're sentient. They're awake. They feel pain. But they don't have most of what makes human consciousness so important. And I think that phenomena is, in the end, software. And I think it has to be installed. I think so. It is an implication of my view, and don't try this at home, don't test this, that if a human baby could be raised entirely without any interaction with other human beings and cut off from language, if it could grow to adulthood without benefit of all the thinking tools that would normally be installed in the course of just growing up in a social community, I think that human being would have a mind so profoundly different from ours that we would all pretty well agree he or she wasn't really conscious. Now, that may be a very eccentric notion of consciousness, but if you're wanting to know, do I think that, if you look for a better notion of consciousness, or one that isn't so eccentric, and you start thinking about what it is, you know, the capacity to experience color and flavor and to have qualia, as philosophers say, I think that's all pretty badly confused, and I've tried to say how and why over the years. But part of what makes it confusing is that people want consciousness to be, to use a technical term, supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. And if you're not talking about something that is supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, they think you're not talking about consciousness. And there's a quote, my friend Lee Siegel is a philosopher and a magician, a very fine stage magician, wrote a wonderful book on Indian street magic called Net of Magic. And there's a passage in there I love to quote. He says, I tell my friends I'm writing a book on magic, and they ask, do you mean real magic? And by real magic, they mean magical, they mean, thaumaturgical acts and so forth. And he says, no, not real magic, sleight of hand, you know, stage magic. And then he goes on, he says, in other words, the kind of magic you can actually do is not real magic. Real magic is the kind that doesn't exist. Well, what I've come to realize in my whole career is I've been confronted with people, because what I want to deal with are topics that a lot of people think of as real magic, free will and consciousness in particular. And if you don't mean something that, as one proponent of it says, every free decision is a little miracle. If you don't think that that's what free will is, then you're not talking about free will. Not real free will. You're talking about some cheesy substitute. And I'm all for the cheesy substitutes, I'm afraid. I think they're quite good enough. And science can explain why we have varieties of free will that are worth wanting, even if they aren't real free will. They'll secure our lives as meaningful and responsible and so forth. And we can have consciousness, even if it isn't something that sunders the universe in twain in this very special way. Sorry, it's such a long answer, but you got me going.
What do you think about utilitarianism and moral reasoning?
I'm not a utilitarian, or at least not an ordinary utilitarian. I don't know if any. I'm a consequentialist. That is to say, I think the consequences matter. I'm not one who takes a strictly deontological view of ethics, using some technical terms. I want to try to get away from them. This is an issue that's very close to the surface in work that I'm doing right now on free will and punishment. Because I say, no, we don't. I notoriously said in my last book on free will, I don't want to live, in an article on free will, I don't want to live in a world without punishment. And these people jumped all over me and said, oh, you dirty retributivist, you. I said, no, I'm not a retributivist. Kant was the great retributivist. And if you want to know what bullet he bit, he said, if we knew the world was going to end tomorrow, one of our highest duties would be to go into the prisons and execute the people on death row. Ugh. By that, he wanted us to think that punishment was in itself good. That is, a crime unpunished is a sort of an offense to nature or God or something. And that's what a retributivist is, one who thinks that punishment is a good in itself. I don't. But I think it's a very foundational good for a very simple reason. I want to live in a world in which there are promises. And you can't really have promisers unless there's consequences for not keeping your promise. And those consequences are not rehabilitation. They're not reform. They're punishment. And it's okay. And we should all be willing to say, no, I'd rather take my punishment. I'd rather be a free citizen in a free society. I accept that if I do something really wrong, I am eligible for punishment, and that's okay. I think the world we live in, when we have a system of, law and order with punishment, I think our current system of punishment is obscene and should be completely reformed, but I don't think we should eliminate punishment, as some of the current crop of cognitive scientists and neuroscientists are saying. I don't think they've looked closely at the last time this was considered a really wise move, and that was back in the Stalinist era when, people weren't punished, they were treated. I don't think we want to be treated. I think we want to be punished. Because then there's rules, and you can sort of serve your time and get out and be a citizen again. On that dire note, I'll stop.
There was a decision this week about patents that touched on some deeply philosophical issues. The question was whether software should be patentable. And one of the opinions, which unfortunately didn't gather majority support, was that basically things you do in software are like natural laws. They're tools that everybody can use, and some particular arrangement of these tools should not be patentable. Other judges felt that if you have a computer and it's programmed with software, that's a new device, and devices are clearly patentable. Do you have some wisdom to offer us on that?
Well, I've thought about it in the past. I've thought about the difference between patent and copyright and trade secret. And actually, I'm trying to think about this in quite fundamental terms, because I think that what we need to develop is the sense of information which is distinct from Shannon-Weaver information, which depends on Shannon-Weaver information, but is semantic information, is cognitive information. And to me, the best way of thinking about this is that it's useful. information. It is information defined as that which permits the transmission of adaptations for one purpose, one utility or another. And then under that view, then of course software, I think intuitively when we're measuring whether software, what counts as theft, we have to look at the utility. And if it's the utility that's been stolen, then we should have penalties for that. That should be discouraged. The trouble is that copyright law also involves this idea. It's a good question, and I'm not surprised that is this at the Supreme Court? Is this, no?
No, it's the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit that handles patent
I want to know
cases.
more about it. I'm not surprised that they are divided. I think it's a tough issue. But obviously, when I talk about apps as tools for thinking, I am thinking of these as mechanisms that have been designed. And so on that ground, I would say, I would tend to come down on the side that you can patent it. Thank you.